Former editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews Ben Aris joins us now from Berlin. Welcome to the programme. Thanks for coming on. How do you read the situation at the moment in Belarus? Because Lukashenko doesn't appear at all to want to let go. And the protesters, well, they seem as energized as ever. I mean, we've just seen these incredible images of the protests over this weekend.
Yeah, there's what's developed into a standoff. I mean, both sides have dug in that Lukashenko remains in power and he now has lost the support of the entire population. The only thing holding him up now is the security forces, the military, who remain loyal. And that loyalty was bolstered by Russia's Putin's statement saying he has this special force to back up Lukashenko regime should things get out of hand, if necessary, was the key phrase. And by that, he said that should the protesters actually become violent and try and do things like take over administrative buildings, and then we go down a sort of Maidan Ukraine scenario. In that case, Russia would probably send in some troops, some forces. At the same time, Lukashenko, he can't stop these protests. The protests that we had at the weekend, the images you've been showing, was again record-breaking. These protests are bigger than the protests we saw in 1991 when the population demanded the withdrawal of Soviet control from their country. The whole country is inflamed and they're not going to back down. However, they don't have any means to eject Lukashenko. So, as I say, we have a standoff now between the two sides, and it's not clear how this will be resolved.
And what difference, if any at all, will the fact that the opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya will be addressing the UN later this week? She already addressed the EU last week.
Indeed. The opposition has been very clear. They've called on the international community to support them. And by that, messages of solidarity to delegitimize Lukashenko by rejecting the presidential election result, where it was massively falsified. Lukashenko gave himself 80% of the vote. Nobody believes that. The real poll results that we've seen by the few rebel polling stations who released the real results show quite the opposite. Tsikhanouskaya won by a landslide. However, at the same time, the Belarusians are very cautious, very nervous about being dragged into this sort of geopolitical standoff between Moscow and the West. And they don't want the outside world to take sides. They themselves, even the opposition, have said that they see their future in close economic cooperation with Russia, which is their major economic partner. And so they're trying to go for some sort of neutral space in between where they'll be friends with Russia on the one side, and at the same time, they'll be friends with the West and expand those relationships. So the call to the UN, I think, is again for solidarity for the people of Belarus against Lukashenko, who is clearly not legitimate president. But at the same time, they're not calling for things like sanctions. They don't want the West to try and force Lukashenko out. This is a conversation between the people and Lukashenko, and they want to keep it that way.
And Ben, what needs to happen for this to be resolved? Because as you mentioned in your first answer, Lukashenko, he still has his inner core supporting him.
Indeed. I mean, up until Putin's comment, we thought that the sentiment that the president could not stand up against his entire population. And the best case scenario was that, because the economy is now sliding into crisis, that the Belarusian ruble has been dropping significantly. There's a general strike, so the country's not making any money. It's got very limited hard currency reserves. And so the government's going to run out of money in a month or two, and there'll be an economic crisis. And the hope was that the elites around Lukashenko would see that the country's being destroyed for the sake of this one man who wants to cling on to power, and that they would abandon him, and that they would open conversation with the opposition, and then there would be a move towards a transition government. But Russia's involvement now has changed all of that. The promise of the special forces means that the chances of the elite, the troops, mutinying is much less because they think Russia's got their back. And at the same time, Russia's already given Lukashenko $1 billion in terms of debt relief, and more money will probably be coming, which means that they can stave off an economic crisis, which leaves Lukashenko in power, albeit very shaky basis for his power. And I think what the Kremlin wants to do is slow the whole process down so that they can control the situation, they can negotiate with the opposition to get an outcome they like, or they could groom a candidate of their own to come in that would be agreeable to both the people and the Kremlin. So we're looking at a much more drawn-out process than we were hoping for.
Ben, thank you so much for that great analysis. Ben Aris, former editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. Thank you.